Chapter 20 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. JANIFER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After the first rush of battle, matters began to quiet a little. Against tremendous odds, and in a few brief hours, the armaments of Fruyling's World had managed to beat off the Confederation fleets, and these had withdrawn to reform and to prepare for a new phase of the engagement. In the far-off days before the Age of Confederation, war had perhaps been an affair of grinding, constant attack and defense. No one could say for sure. Many records were gone. Much had been destroyed. But now there was waiting, preparation, linked batteries of armaments, and calculators for prediction. And then the brief rush and flurry of battle, followed by the immense waiting once more. For Dodd, it was a time to breathe and to look around. He had enough work to do. The damage to Building 3 and the confusion among the Alberts had to be dealt with, and all knew time was short. Very few of the Alberts had actually escaped, and most of those, Dodd told himself bitterly, would die in their own jungles for lack of knowledge or preparation. Most, though, simply milled around, waiting for the masters, wondering and worrying. Norma was safe, of course. After a frantic search, Dodd had found her below ground in the basements of Building 1, along with most of the Psych Division. Without present duties forcing them to guard or maintain the Alberts, the Psych Division had holed up almost entire, in the steel corridors that echoed with the dull booms of the battle. He'd gasped out some statement of relief, and Norma had smiled at him. "I knew you'd be safe," she said. "I knew you had to be." And, of course, she was right. Even if what she said sounded cold, removed. He had to remember that she was under shock, too. The attack had come unexpectedly on them all. It didn't matter what she said. She was safe. He was glad of that. Of course he was, he thought. Of course he was. Even if the things she said, the cold-blooded way she looked at the world, sometimes bothered him. And a day later, when everyone was picking up the scattered pieces of the world and attempting somehow to rig a new defense, she'd said more. Not about herself, or about him. Tacitly, they knew all of that had to wait for a conclusion to the battle. But about the Alberts. "Of course, they're not disloyal," she told him calmly. "They don't even know what disloyalty means. We've seen to that. The masters are as much a part of their world as food, I suppose. You don't stage a rebellion against food, do you?" Dodd frowned. "But some of them have escaped." "Wandered, you mean. Just wandered off. Oh, I suppose a few have. Our methods aren't perfect, but they are pretty good, Johnny. Look at the number of Alberts who simply stayed around." "We're making them slaves." "No." She shook her head violently. "Nobody can make a slave. All we've done is seize an opportunity. Think of our own history, Johnny. First the clan, or the band, some sort of extended family group. Then, when real leadership is needed, the slave and master relationship." "Now wait a minute," Dodd said. Norma had been brainwashed into some silly set of slogans. It was his job to break them down. "The clan can elect leaders." "Sure it can," she said. "But democracy is a civilized commodity, Johnny. In a primitive society, it's a luxury the society can't afford. What guarantees have you got that the clan will elect the best possible leader? Or that, having elected him, they'll follow him along the best paths? Self-interest—" But again she cut him off. "Self-interest is stupid," she said casually. "A child needs to learn. Schooling is in the best interest of that child. Agreed?" "Yes, but—" "Did you ever hear of a child who liked school, Johnny?" she asked. "Did you ever hear of a child who went to school regularly, eagerly, without some sort of force being applied, physical, mental, or moral? No, Johnny, self-interest is short-sighted. Force is all that works." But he was sure she was wrong, but he couldn't see where. "Who are we to play God for them?" he said at last. "They need somebody," Norma said, "and we need them. Even." She seemed harder now, somehow more decided. Dodd saw that the one attack had changed a lot. In Norma, in everyone. Albin, for instance, wasn't involved with fun anymore. He had turned into a fanatical drill sergeant with a squad of Alberts under him, and it was even rumored that he slept in their quarters. And Norma, what had happened to her? After the fighting was over and they could talk again, could they relax and reach out for each other once again? She had become so hard. One new fear ran through the defenders. The Alberts who had escaped might return, some said, vowing vengeance against the masters. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. JANIFER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cadnan had learned much in a very short time. Everyone was hurried now, as the time of mating approached more and more quickly, and as the days sped by. Knowledge was thrown at Cadnan and at Dara in vast, indigestible lumps, and they were left to make what they could of it, while the others went about their normal assigned work. He learned about the invasion, for instance, or as much about it as Marvor, the elders, and a few other late arrivals could piece together. Their explanations made surprisingly good sense, in the main, though none of them, not even Marvor, could quite comprehend the notion of masters having masters above them. It seemed contrary to reason. Cadnan learned also the new trees in this new place which the elders had found. There were food trees nearby, and others whose leaves were meant for building, and there were also trees of mating, like his own bent line tree. No one could tell Cadnan where Bent Line Tree itself might be, and so he became resigned to his first mating with a new tree, which the elders had called Great Root Tree. It was not truly right, he told himself, but there was nothing to do about it. The life in the jungle made Cadnan uncomfortable. He was nothing larger than himself, and he felt very small. When he had masters, he was a part of something great, of the chain of obedience. But here in the jungle, there was no chain. And would the trees obey when their time came? And each felt himself alone. It was not good to feel alone, Cadnan decided. Yet again, there was nothing he could do. It mattered for a time, and then it ceased to matter. The time of mating came closer and closer, and Cadnan felt his own needs grow with the hours. The sun rose and fell and rose again. Then the time came. It was dark. There were others near them, but they were alone. Cadnan knew Dara was standing near him in the darkness, though he saw nothing. He heard her breath coming slowly at first, and then a little faster. He did not hear his own, but that was no matter. There was a sound from a small night animal, but it did not come near. He stood with Dara near to Great Root Tree. If he put out his hand, he could touch it. But he kept his hand at his side. Touching the tree at that moment was wrong. There were the old rules, the true rules, and to think of them made him feel better. Dara said nothing. It was not necessary for her to speak. They knew each other, and the attraction was very strong. Cadnan had felt the attraction before, but until that moment he had not known how strong it was. And then it grew and grew. Still they did not move. Darkness covered both, and there was no more sound. The very feeling of the presence of others disappeared. There was nothing but Cadnan and Dara and Great Root Tree. It called to him, but not to him alone. He knew what he had to do. He felt the front of his body growing warm, and then hot. He felt the first touch of the liquid. He touched Dara. Their fronts touched. That alone was more than Cadnan had ever imagined, Yet it was not enough. Still there was more he was called on to do. He didn't think about it or know of it until it was done. He moved against Dara as she against him. He was not himself. He was more and less. He was only the front of his body, and he was Great Root Tree. He was all trees, all worlds. When he stepped back, it was like dying. But he could not die, since there was more for him to do. He stood still, very close to Dara, and, remaining close, he went to the tree. It was not far, and both knew the path, but it seemed far. Cadnan could feel the mixed liquids on his front, his and Dara's. Great Root Tree seemed to call these liquids to itself, and himself and Dara with them. They walked to it. In the darkness they could not see it, but they knew the tree. They had spent time knowing it before that night. Cadnan reached out a slow hand and touched the back of the tree, almost as smooth as metal, with only minute irregularities throughout its surface. Once again a long time seemed to pass, but it was not long. Then he was against the tree while Dara stood behind, waiting. He pressed himself against the bark and he felt himself becoming part of Great Root Tree, becoming the tree itself, and this lasted for all time and no time, and he was separated from it and saw Dara come to where he had pressed, and move delicately and then fiercely upon the bark. Then he saw nothing, but heard her breathing faster and faster, and all sound stopped. There was a long silence, and then her breathing began again, very slowly, very slowly. She returned to Cadnan and took his hand. It was finished. Soon the tree would bud with the results of the liquids rubbed on it. After that there would be small ones, and Cadnan would be an elder. All of this was in the future, and it was very dim in Cadnan's mind, but everything was dim. He lay on the ground and Dara lay near him, both very tired, too tired to think of anything, and he felt himself shaking for a time, and his breath hissed in and out until the shaking stopped. Dara, too, was quiet at last. The darkness had not changed. There was no sound and no motion. It was over. End of chapter 21.